Good evening, everyone, and welcome to St. George's Talks, a monthly lecture series live from a historic German church in London's East End. Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren, und willkommen in St. Georg's Gespräche. My name is Rick Jones, and I am a committee member looking after secular events which happen here, talks and concerts mainly. During lockdown, we went virtual and now present the talks to both a real audience here at St. George's and a virtual one at home in their pajamas. Themes reflect the history of St. George's, which was once the hub of a community of German 18th century migrant workers who raised funds in 1763 to build this place. It's hardly changed since then and still has all its old box pews, its galleries, its wheezy organ. This talk is the 24th since we began to Zoom last year. Our guest tonight is author, journalist, broadcaster, lecturer. He is Professor of Contemporary Thought at Brunel University and introduces psychogeography to students, which concerns relationships between us humans and the modern built environment. The subject of this talk, I'll just wait for the tech Imo here to do his stuff. The subject of this talk, the German writer Sebald, practiced psychogeography unwittingly in England, where he lived, and may have wandered in this street and found this church while waiting for his Liverpool Street Station train to Norwich, where he taught. Our guest has given many talks on Sebald, who was killed in a road accident at Norwich on the 14th of December 2001. As broadcaster, our speaker also risked his life by driving in an old East German Trabant car from London to Berlin last year, relating his adventures on the radio. It still amuses me to picture him confining his 2-meter frame inside the tinny box, his knees against the dash. Of his 11 novels, several have won prizes, like The Butt, whose hero's final cigarette before he quits ignites unlikely psychogeographical amusing escapades, and was adjudged the funniest book 2008 to win the Bollinger Everyman Woodhouse Prize. A bubbly Jeroboam, and the book's name given to a pig, a Gloucester Old Spot, which is known for hardiness, docility, intelligence, and prolificity. 4 attributes which equally describe this evening's speaker. Questions afterward, here live or in the chat if you're at home. Will you welcome, please, our speaker this evening, Will Self.
I swam out to sea with a great sense of lightness, very far out. So far that I felt I could simply let myself drift away into the evening and so into the night. But as soon as, obeying the strange instinct that binds us to life, I turned back after all and made for the land which from this distance resembled a foreign continent. Swimming became more and more difficult with every stroke. And not as if I were laboring against the current that had been carrying me on before. No, I was inclined to think that I was swimming steadily uphill, if one can say so of a stretch of water. The view before my eyes seemed to have tipped out of its frame, was leaning towards me, swaying and flickering of its own accord, with the upper rim of the picture skewed several degrees in my direction and the lower rim skewed away from me to the same extent. And sometimes I felt as if the prospect towering so menacingly in front of me was not a part of the real world, but the reproduction of a now insuperable inner faintness turned inside out and shot through with blue-black markings. That quote from WG Sebald's posthumous collection of essays, Campo Santo, in fact, it's from the titular piece itself, seems a suitable place to start this evening's talk. Doubly suitable because I'm looking at exactly that sort of screen at the same moment. And it hadn't even occurred to me that quite possibly Sebald was unconsciously or consciously echoing the image of a laptop screen tilted in towards him as he was swimming off the coast of Corsica on one of his visits to the island. The title of this talk is The Ghost of Future Past, WG Sebald and the Trauma of Modernity. It's a seasonal sort of title, but it's not that happy a thing to talk about trauma, which is in many senses what Sebald has been most identified with as a writer, specifically the trauma of the Nazis' exterminatory Holocaust of European Jewry. Rick said I'd given many talks on Sebald. I can only think of 2 or 3. Probably the most significant was the 11th anniversary lecture I gave, the WG Sebald Memorial Lecture at King's Place in 2011, organized by the British Centre for Literary Translation at UEA, which Sebald was himself responsible for setting up. In that talk, that lecture, I discussed, which was entitled Absence, Jews and Invisible Executioners. I addressed myself specifically to Sebald's consideration of the Holocaust. But I ended that lecture by saying that I felt that for Sebald, the Holocaust was only a special and specific subset of a greater Holocaust that his literature was specifically designed to address. That Holocaust is the ecocide that humanity is perpetrating on the non-human world at the moment. It was interesting coming to prepare this lecture to try and have a look at how much had been written on the connection between Sebald and environmentalism and specifically the climate emergency. Very little is the answer. There's also very little on a thinker who I suspect influenced Sebald a great deal more than either he or we might care to admit, the philosopher Martin Heidegger. Indeed, I think a lot of Sebald's growing environmental awareness almost certainly came from his reading of Heidegger and certain key Heideggerian concepts, specifically Heidegger's essay, The Question Concerning Technology, written in the 1930s, but not published in its final form till the 1950s. I may return to that if I have time. I'm not sure I will. There's a lot to say. There's a lot to say about this. It's a large claim to say that a writer who is mostly recognized for one thing should be recognized for something else. But that's a universal genius for you. What could be more pressing than the environmental crisis on a writer? And again, Sebald's unauthorized biography was published last year, written by Carole Angier, who researched it for many, many years. I did a couple of events with Carole and involved her in the Archive on 4 20th anniversary program we did on Sebald's work. Talking to me, she underscored that people had mentioned to her many times that Sebald seemed preternaturally concerned with the anthropogenic destruction of the environment. But in fact, there's only one reference to this in the entire biography, which is nearly 700 pages long. And it's a colleague of Sebald's at UEA, at the University of East Anglia, saying that at parties in the 1970s, well before such topics were that trendy or zeitgeisty, Sebald would be drinking a glass of water and would comment extempore to another guest or a colleague that water was going to be a problem in the future. Resources were going to be a problem in the future. I've got two arguments for saying that Sebald's work is principally concerned with ecocide, and also that Sebald recognized something that contemporary liberal humanists find very hard to stomach, since it flies in the face of their entire ideological project, which is that there is no anthropic solution to anthropogenic climate change at all. The last year has seen greenhouse gas emissions massively increase, partly à cause de la crise in Ukraine, but actually because humans are going to burn everything they can, because that's what humans do. And I think that if you read Sebald rightly, he understands that. He understands that about the nature of technology and the nature of technology's impact on the collective human psyche. And I need to underscore at the outset, Sebald was not a liberal humanist. He did not believe, as all liberal humanists do, that human beings are perfectible by means of their own social activities, and that an aspect of those social activities is technology itself and its progress. I wrote an essay a couple of years ago for Harper's Magazine in New York called A Posthumous Shock, about contemporary trauma and the sense of trauma and the trauma of modernity. It struck me that trauma is a posthumous shock, and not only that, it reverses causality. A little form of it is when you bang yourself on the head unexpectedly, and you think that is an effect that should have preceded its cause. I should have seen that coming. That is the archetype of almost all trauma, I would argue, in the modern world. The great, also German theorist of the industrialization of space and time in the 19th century, Wolfgang Schivelbusch, postulated the idea of what he called the technological bubble. The idea that once you have adjusted yourself to the means in which a particular technology protects you from the environment, when it collapses, you experience it as a traumatic response. His exemplary form of the arrival of trauma in the modern consciousness was what was called in the 19th century railway spine. And it's the point at which people begin to realize that trauma, while leaving no obvious physical symptoms, can nonetheless cause profound psychological ones. Early railways were incredibly dangerous. They crashed all the time. And yet within 20 years of the rocket running its first trip, People were sitting in railway carriages, reading newspapers, journals, and books that they'd bought at WH Smith's, a business that had come into being specifically to ameliorate the novel forms of ennui that train rides occasion. And they completely lost awareness of the steely wheels slicing away within a few centimeters of their genitals. When the train crashed, they experienced the popping of the technological bubble and the trauma of that occasion, the effect that should have preceded its cause, because they were not present in their own environment at the point at which that environment collapsed. They had suspended their own natural wariness and handed it over to a technological form. You could argue that at least in prosperous Western nations, the coronavirus pandemic represented another kind of pricking of the technological bubble. Today is an emblematic day for modern trauma with an ambulance driver's strike. We are completely accustomed to the idea, and in London in particular, since they insist on driving around with such loud sirens in the streets, a function of a technological arms race between car drivers who sit in their little steel cubicles full of their own farts, listening to extremely loud music, and the need for the ambulance to make its way through the traffic. It's no wonder that we've come to believe that anything that ails us should immediately be ameliorated by a swift trip to a highly equipped hospital. The pandemic, now this strike, pop that particular bubble to some extent. I believe trauma of that kind is a correlate of modernity. And I believe that Sebald thought that as well. There's two smoking guns for my argument on interpreting Sebald. One is the work itself and how we interpret it. But the other thing is the one that's most unfashionable in literary critical circles, which is the affirmation of the writer themselves. I'll get to the second point in due course. This isn't about me, but I enter Carole Angier's biography of Sebald very early on in the first 2 or 3 pages. Why? Because at that King's Place lecture I gave on the 11th anniversary of Sebald's death, after the lecture, having asserted in the context of the lecture that the first character in Sebald's astonishing story cycle, The Emigrants, was based on a Jewish man, a Jewish refugee from Central Europe, who Sebald had known himself. The daughter of the real-life model for Henry Selwyn in The Emigrants came up to me and said, "How do you know that my father was Jewish? He wasn't Jewish at all. Sebald fabricated this." And I said, I knew it because I had read it in an interview that the writer had given with Carole Angier in 1996, at a point when he was scarcely known in the English-speaking world. I appear a second time in the Angier biography, 700 pages long. I never met Sebald, but he met me. In the lecture I gave in 2011, I drew largely on the corpus of Sebald's work that is well known. There are many, many references to ecocide in the main books. In particular, I focused on the repeated evocation of Theresienstadt, the Nazis' exemplary concentration camp built in the star-shaped fortress, 18th century fortress, a few miles outside Prague, where the Prague Jews, among them Kafka's, a writer that Sebald, of course, particularly admired, who doesn't? And is particularly important for this argument as well. Kafka's three sisters were confined before being sent on, along with the rest of the 50,000 members of the Jewish community in Czechoslovakia, to the death camps. Or, as the chilling phrase puts it, to serve under the chimney in the Buna at Auschwitz, a phrase that Sebald applied to his character Max Ferber, based on the painter Frank Auerbach, and to his own exile in Manchester. The explicit equivalence between the industrialization of Manchester and the concentration camp. Theresienstadt, I think, for Sebald, represented such a powerful motif of ecocide, not just the Holocaust, because of a notorious film made of it by the Red Cross. During the peak of the Holocaust in 1943, the camp was established by Reinhard Heydrich, as you may know, and at one time in less than a square kilometer contained something like 30 or 40,000 Jews, who, in a bizarre parody of civilization, were encouraged to have their own symphony orchestra, to publish, to do all manner of crafts and artisanal work, all of which was filmed spuriously by the Red Cross and released as a sort of parody of civilization, whereas of course the reality was that this was just a way station on the way to death. I think Sebald viewed our civilization as a parody on the way station to death. I also, in that lecture, considered things like the juxtaposition in the Rings of Saturn between the extraordinary evocation of both the abundance of the European fishery, specifically the herring, in what used to be called the German Ocean up until the First World War and then became the North Sea. And again, Sebald's notorious use of photography in his books, a photograph of naked and dead Jewish bodies lying among trees in Lithuania during the first actions of the Einsatzgruppen when they moved in the wake of the Wehrmacht during Operation Barbarossa. I also alluded to that Manchester necropolis under the chimney. But I didn't want to kind of go back to Austerlitz, the emigrants, the Rings of Saturn, Vertigo. I'm not a completist, and despite having lectured and written on Sebald, I haven't read him exhaustively. So I decided to look at two of his works I knew much less and see whether they would support my thesis. Campo Santo, and his first published book-length work, the poem After Nature, from which we have this. But the habit of often falling down in the street and often sitting with bandaged hands by the open window between the potted fuchsias, waiting for the pain to subside, and for hours doing nothing but looking out, early on induced me to imagine a silent catastrophe that occurs almost unperceived. Sebald suffered from eczema as a child, hence the bandaged hands. At least superficially, he's talking about the Nazis' exterminatory Holocaust that is going on during his childhood. But I believe he's also referring to the environmental catastrophe. And indeed, I think this always hides behind the extreme and specialized form of ecocide that was the Holocaust. The melancholy, not douceur de la vie, a kind of bitter sadness about life that permeates Sebald's work. Carol Angier's biography, of course, inevitably considers the question of whether suicide was involved in his death. Looking again at photographs of him today, I mean, I know I look great, but don't laugh slightly. Acclaim, in fact. Poor Sebald, looking at, he died 4 years younger than me, white hair, looking like an old man, incredibly unfair. He seemed to will himself to some extent into the grave. He seemed to be one of those people who obviously couldn't kill himself because he had a daughter he loved a great deal. Indeed, he was in the car with him when he had the fatal stroke that led to the car crash. Everywhere. Lasciati mi morir, he says in Campo Santo, referring to the aria in La Traviata. And then a very Sebaldian touch, or some such closing aria, as if to displace the meaning. Let me die. And again from Campo Santo, the more blood flowed on the battlefield, this Belgian scholar told me, the greener Napoleon thought the grass was growing. The argument being that since Napoleon was colorblind. But turn the motif around. Think of the idea that in human warfare, we're turning the grass blood red. I think that's what's encoded there. The sense always in Sebald's works, for those of you who are familiar with them, that the living are already dead. Here he is again in Corsica, the book project he aborted to work on Austerlitz. At first sight, I really believed that the only reminders in the Piana graveyard of the nature which we have always hoped will endure long after our own end were the artificial purple, mauve, and pink flowers obviously pressed upon their customers by French undertakers, made of silk or nylon chiffon, of brightly painted porcelain, wire, and metal, appearing not so much a sign of enduring affection as the final emergence of a kind of proof that despite all assurances to the contrary, we offer our dead only the cheapest substitutes for the diverse beauty of life. We offer ourselves only the cheapest substitutes for the diverse beauty of life. The artificiality of the flowers is the artificiality of the specular world that surrounds us with its computers, its constant mirroring of the anthropic world. I think that's what Sebald was driving at here. And it goes on. The ornamental funerary plants sold by German cemetery florists, usually consisting of heathers, dwarf conifers, and pansies of absolutely standard shape, planted in spotless soot-black soil in strict geometrical rows, as I still see them in unwelcome memories of my now distant childhood and youth in the foothills of the Alps. Again, the evocation of human artificiality, the equivalence between the cemetery and the city. It's there in every line. And there again in Campo Santo, photography, which in essence, after all, is nothing but a way of making ghostly apparitions materialize by means of a very dubious magical art. Schivelbusch in The Railroad Age, in which he introduces this idea of the technological bubble, tells us that the viewers of the first photographs experienced a strange frisson, not looking at photographs or images of people, but of ordinary objects, as if they had been and then re-realized in the process of photography. I think as a civilization, we have now been involved in almost, well, actually, it's about the 200th anniversary of the first photograph ever taken. We've been involved in a long process of derealization and botched re-realization. They are still around us, the dead, but there are times when I think that perhaps they will soon be gone. Now that we have reached a point where the number of those alive on Earth has doubled within just 3 decades and will treble within the next generation, we need no longer fear the once overwhelming numbers of the dead. Their significance is visibly decreasing. Again, from Campo Santo. Interesting. Sebald introduces here what I would call psychodemography, something we don't like to think about too much, something we saw at work in the pandemic. You don't have to be an alternative right-wing thinker to observe quite candidly that this civilization ground to a halt in order to save the lives of a few 100,000 moribund people. I speak as somebody who was in the shield category due to an immunosuppressant disease myself. So I don't mean it, I just mean this is the kind of Sebaldian objectivity that is written through every line of his prose. To remember, to retain, and to preserve. Pierre Berthaud wrote of the mutation of mankind even 30 years ago was vitally important only when population density was low. We manufactured few items and nothing but space was present in abundance. You could not do without anyone then, even after death. In the urban societies of the late 20th century, on the other hand, where everyone is instantly replaceable and is really superfluous from birth, we have to keep throwing ballast overboard, forgetting everything that we might otherwise remember. Youth, childhood, our origins, our forebears and ancestors. It's this sense of a terrible plenitude, of a terrible exhaustion in the project of civilization that permeates all of Sebald's work. What other writer would have made that point? And I notice myself, I don't know if it strikes a chord with you. Personal grief may be there. Grief is the price we always pay for love, and we haven't stopped loving. But our sense of a collective ability to mourn is strangely etiolated. And I think that Sebald made the right point. There's more of us than there are of the dead. It's why I think contemporary civilization is such an extraordinary permanent now. The zeitgeist has been democratized. Everybody's part of it. At least that's what they think. But that isn't the real promise at all. And again, you don't have to be a conservative pessimist, although Sebald was not a liberal humanist, in order to understand that what's really going on here is a civilization that is just spinning its wheels and is unable to effect any further progress at all. This from After Nature. The Frankfurt magistrates, when the news of Nithart's passing had reached them, ordered a register to be made of the household effects in his workshop. The long list embraces an accumulation of the most diverse things. Everywhere in Sebald's work are these inventories of objects. I would argue they're not what has been lost, they're what will be lost. Just as with the point about psychodemography. We've got so much more stuff, including the stuff that we're enabled to preserve by our technology from the past, that the great de-accessioning that lies ahead is something that is marked again and again and again throughout Sebald's oeuvre. And leaving a present without memory. in the face of a future that no individual mind can now envisage. In the end, we shall ourselves relinquish life without feeling any need to linger, at least for a while, nor shall we be impelled to pay return visits from time to time. To continue the thought, there will be nobody left for us to haunt. And again, constantly throughout Sebald's work, the references to the destruction of the non-human world in one form or another, the remorselessness of it. This again from Camposanto. The degradation of the most highly developed plant species, trees, is a process known to have begun near what we call the cradle of civilization. The thin wedge of the Anthropocene was something that was a splinter in Sebald's heart. Most of the high forests that once grew all the way to the Dalmatian, Iberian, and North African coasts had already been cut down by the beginning of the present era. Although the game had once lived in such abundance in the forests of the island has been eradicated almost without trace today, the fever of the chase still breaks out on Corsica every September. During my excursions into the interior of the island, I repeatedly felt as if the entire male population were participating in a ritual of destruction which long ago became pointless. Isn't it what it's like with so much of what we do now? It long ago became pointless, but we do it. The exterminatory zeal with which we continue to pursue what we view as the civilizing project. This is Sebald's gloss on Flaubert, one of the writers he admired. Again, not a liberal progressive, in common with, say, Conrad, Nabokov, Stendhal, Kafka. What's extraordinary to me as a writer, looking at the way contemporary culture grapples with these figures, is the attempt to stretch them on the Procrustean bed of progressivism. I mean, the most glaring example, of course, is Kafka, who was recast partly by his friend Max Brod as a sort of Jewish saint. But then, again, by reason of the Holocaust and the Soviets' totalitarian and exterminatory regime, was made into a prophet of a future. Kafka was nothing of the sort. Again, rather like Sebald, he was describing the psychic reality he saw around him at the time. One of the Zurau aphorisms from Kafka that I think Sebald would have particularly liked is, those revolutionary movements who say the decisive moment in history human history is at hand are always right, because according to them, nothing has happened yet. You see it particularly in the frenzied liberal convulsions of the current moment and in the narcissism of small differences that exist between mainstream liberalism and ultra-liberalism in our own culture. For all their evocation of eternity and their enormous size, their design contained within itself the idea of a style of building that revealed all its grandiose aspirations only in a state of destruction. That's Sebald glossing Canetti, writing about Albert Speer's designs for New Germania, the extraordinary capital that Hitler envisaged of his 1,000-year Reich, and a model of which he kept in his rooms at the Reich Chancellery that he would admire constantly the whole time. the synecdoche obsesses Sebald, because of course the synecdoche, the part for whole and the whole for part, is the way to understand our civilizational predicament. Ours is an entire society, not only built according to the principles of Albert Speer's Theorie von Ruinwert, the idea that buildings should look better in destruction than they do when they're standing, but it's already in destruction. Our built environment auto-cannibalizes itself every 20 or 30 years. One of my favorite views in London at the moment is if you go south down Borough High Street from the Elephant and Castle, you reach a point where another St. George's, another 18th century St. George's with a pointed spire is completely framed by a facade of the Shard, Renzo Piano's building, the highest building in Europe. The design specification for the Shard is 75 years. It will be gone, I hope. Not that I particularly object to it. Actually, of all of the grotesque large buildings in London, it's probably the best. But nonetheless, it will be gone. St. George's will still be there. That's what I believe Sebald was writing about. I could go on. I knew I had way too much material for this. I'm only on page 3 and I've got 8. In a way, I'm sorry that I hadn't worked much harder on this essay, or on an essay on this subject, or even, I don't want to write an academic paper. I mean, I'm traveling in the opposite direction to Sebald, whose writing became freer and arguably much better when he abandoned the constrictions of academic writing. But I do feel very strongly about this idea that it's really ecocide, that's the Holocaust that haunts Sebald's work. And I'll kind of end on this before taking some questions. I think that's right for timing. Yeah. I said I appeared a second time in Carole Angier's biography of WG Sebald. I do. In August 1992, I was living outside Leiston, in Suffolk, at a small village called Nobel, on the run from my own demons, living in a small cottage, involved in my own exterminatory acts against the natural world, because when they'd harvest the surrounding wheat fields, every mini beast in the surrounding would come into my cottage, and I'd have to I lived among this sort of thicket of fly papers that I was constantly sort of getting them wrapped up in my hair. Anyway, I used to go walk a lot. I'm a walker, and I knew that Suffolk coast well from childhood as well. Of course, when I read Sebald's Rings of Saturn, I had a shock of recognition, not just of the countryside, but of an encounter I had had in August of 1992 with a tall, slim, melancholy German man on Dunwich Heath. In Angier's biography, she uses this to illustrate what a brilliant writer he was. One of the passages that he excised from the finished version of the Rings of Saturn is his description of meeting me, which she quotes in full. Except, and this shows to me that Sebald was always first and foremost, whatever anybody says about the methods and whatever anybody says about the worrying extent to which he dissimulated in interviews about his sources, he was always first and foremost a writer of fictions, a fabulist, because when he met me, I was working on a book called Great Apes, which was about a thought experiment, imagining what it would have been like if chimpanzees had been the evolutionarily successful primate species rather than their close cousins, humans. You can take a blood transfusion from a chimpanzee. I don't know if you knew that. Anyway, I'm a great believer in fiction by the method. I suspect Sebald was as well, hence the lies to interviewers. And I was knuckle walking, as as chimpanzees do, through the dense maquis of Dunwich Heath. Incidentally, I mean, it's an apocalyptic vision that he has there, but I'm no longer in it. And also uttering pantoots, the distinctive cry that chimpanzees make, which I've learned to do from watching documentaries of Jane Goodall and the Gombe chimpanzees. When I met Max Sebald, I didn't know it was him at the time, in the passage that's excised from Rings of Saturn, he figures me as wearing white silk pantaloons and running shoes that I claim mean I can run faster than a plane. And I'm also, and this detail is indeed correct, wearing a T-shirt, which I did have, strange to relate, with the slogan on it, "Get Airborne." But in fact, since he'd been quite freaked out by hearing me pantooting and seeing me knuckle walking towards him, pretending to be a chimpanzee, he turned me, and our conversation, I'd explained to him that I was a novelist and that's what I was writing about. And of course, the themes of my novel, Great Apes, are also not a million miles away from what I've been discussing in relation to Sebald this evening. So he transforms me from a man impersonating an ape into a kind of emissary of this negative technological world that he sees encompassing us. And the conversation we had was entirely, it's 1992, Jonathan Schell's The Fate of the Earth had just been published. People who'd read Silent Spring or were familiar with Schumacher and Small is Beautiful, maybe with the Whole Earth Guide from the 1960s and 70s, thought about environmentalism, but there was nothing like the demonstrative proof and global anxiety that attends the climate emergency now. Sebald and I discussed the environment and the looming climate emergency in 1992 when we met on Dunwich Heath. Thank you.
Well, Will, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. You have addressed the trauma of modernity in quite some depth there. Fantastic. On Dunwich Heath sounds like a line from Macbeth in a way.
Yes.
And all that might suggest.
Yes, raving.
We'll take questions if people have them. First, I was interested that you brought up the subject of trees. There is that fantastic passage in, I can't remember which, I think the Rings of Saturn, the description of the storm in 1986 when trees were uprooted all over the country, and he gives them this anthropomorphic sense of trees bending down to the earth, this great sort of animated flexibility that trees have looking out of his window. And many people remember that as clearly as he described it too. So,
yeah, I mean, wrong denomination, Rick, but I think you can take the boy out of Catholicism, but you can't take Catholicism out of the boy. And I think that image in the Rings of Saturn is the harrowing of hell by Jesus. And I think also that there is a lot of religious imagery in Sebald that, again, simply does not square with any kind of liberal, progressive, or humanist idea of him as a writer or thinker.
yeah.
He said notably that he had no belief in free will. He had no belief in free will. Think about that. What does that mean? His favorite, the organizing principle of his book, Vertigo, is that marvelous fragment by Kafka, the hunter Gracchus. The hunter, the Bavarian hunter who falls into a valley and then is hovering in limbo between life and death. Says of himself, I am always on that wide stair, moving first up, first down, first to the right, then to the left. I used to be a hunter. Now I'm a butterfly.
Thank you. Now, do we have any questions? Ola.
I must confess I haven't read his books, but I've read about him. Did he write in English or in German and it was translated?
Well, very interesting question. He wrote in German, was translated in Carol's biography, Angier's biography. I see no reason to dispute. She says he pretty much drove his first English translator, Michael Hulse, to despair with the extent of his revisions, because the truth of the matter is he revised every single line of the English translations. He was obviously completely fluent and bilingual. He probably could have written in English. It's an achievement. He's a unique writer in that sense. It's not true of Beckett. Once Beckett started writing in French, he wrote in French. It's not true of Nabokov. Once he started writing in German, he wrote in German. And then once he started writing in English, he wrote in English. It's not true of Conrad. He didn't write anything much before he started writing in English. And that was in French, not in Polish. Sebald is unique in that way, because he wrote in English and German, almost simultaneously. So he crafted both versions himself very, very strongly. I think there are all sorts of reasons, and it's something I dealt with in the previous lecture I gave on him, as to why he should be so beloved in the English-speaking world, rather more than he is in the German-speaking world, though that's changing now. I think it's in part because the English love the idea of the good German, and they love the idea that the good German could only possibly come into being on English soil. Yes.
Just a question about the idea of the very intellectually interested and knowing about but don't you think too that given he was a very they found that what happened to 6 to 8 people to prison national do you not think though that that's true? It's now judging do you think that that's true for an extension from that horror? That we didn't use it in country, and that really you don't understand the world in general. That
You might as well say, I mean, he went to Munich to study. You might as well say a boy from a deep rural background in the Bavarian Alps, then going to a major city might be affected in the same way. So the fact that it was coincident with his realization that the sort of bumbling old professors who were teaching him had in fact, not that old at that time, middle-aged professors, were in fact complicit with the Nazi regime. I mean, yeah, but you know, he over-egged it in all sorts of ways. I mean, one of the most extraordinary things I think that the Angier biography reveals is quite how unpleasant he was to his father. And again, I fell for this one because Sebald definitely gives the impression in the work that his father was, as a member of the Wehrmacht and a member of the Nazi Party, was almost certainly involved in atrocities of one sort or another. He absolutely joins it. He wasn't anywhere near atrocities. He ended up his life as a social democratic councillor. Yeah. I mean, the intensity of his, you know, it's said of male novelists in particular, their first book is an act of parricide. All of Sebald's books were acts of parricide in that way. You know, so I think you could turn to that. No, but I think you make a very good point, and of course that's important. But I think what's extraordinary about this, I mean, it's like how many people have flown in the last year? Yeah. Are you members of the Nazi Party? How many of you own a private car? Put your hands up. Those of you prepared to be. You members of the Nazi Party? How many of you eat beef? You members of the Nazi Party? In a way, if you take the climate emergency seriously, Mm. Well, I think that's how a lot of people who got caught up in the Third Reich felt about it as well.
38 people online.
Yeah.
Some of whom are maybe going to ask a question, but so far nobody has. People asking questions here. Could you keep them brief, please? And would you be so kind as to repeat so people are?
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, not terribly articulate, but and we are talking about his stories and how to try and show them much. But while you're talking, I just wondered whether there's sort of primary thing that was actually three months of reading and I and one year. Sadly. But this sort of binary position that you don't want to belong in either camp. And this reason endlessly to the as the wonder. I mean, what things that you want that the wandering Jew. And that's something about not only language, but about not belonging to things and being observing the animals and see and brings to that it's not writing in one language, but it's quite fun. So it's something that I've been choosing to do that. It's very
That's a very long question. You make it very hard for me to repeat that for people. So I suppose you're saying, was it a conscious choice, the adoption of exile on his part?
It's sort of wandering between cultures.
Well, I wouldn't say that the wandering is the wandering Jew. I'd say it's much more the wandering of Dasein in Heidegger. It's much more the wandering. I think also, like for Heidegger, for Sebald, truth is not a matter of correspondence. Truth appropriates, truth draws nearer, truth reveals itself. Truth lies in the ontology of being. It doesn't lie in any kind of factual estimation. You know, Heidegger writes in the question concerning technology, his problem with technology is that it frames reality. The problem with technology is that we have a ridiculous tendency to regard it as a standing reserve. The car's just parked outside waiting for you to use it and is not a thing anymore. It's just an object in that way. And as in English, in German also, object is an objection, you know, and the car isn't inert when you're not driving it. It's still, the coltan in it is still killing child soldiers in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That's acutely present in Sebald's work. And as I say, the other smoking gun, I mean, I had it from the man himself, his environmental preoccupations. Unfortunately, on Dunwich Heath, we didn't talk about the legacy of Heidegger. Obviously a problematic figure for Sebald, since Heidegger was a member of the Nazi Party. So I don't know. I don't think people choose much in life, and I don't think Sebald believed he'd chosen anything much in his life. He said emphatically in several interviews that he did not recognize the conception of free will, that conception of autonomy. So it couldn't be true for him that he would feel that he had chosen anything in quite that sense. Anybody else?
If anybody would like to ask a question, a suggestion from the floor is that we come to the front. So
Oh yeah, particularly if it's going to be a sort of rhodomontade. Oh, at the back there, but yeah, come up. Yeah, do join us. Yeah, you need to come to the microphone, yeah. None of this works without technology. You notice that?
You sort of suggested that Theresienstadt was a parody of civilization for the Nazis, and if our civilization is a parody, what is being parodied?
Good question. If our civilization is being parodied, what is being parodied? And the answer is progress. That's what's being parodied. There's a common shibboleth on the left nowadays to say, why is it easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism? And the answer is capitalism is ending the world. That's why. Because capitalism is itself a technology, as we understand. So I think that's what's being parodied by our civilization. What's been parodied by our civilization is our notion of the civilizations of the past. You know, this civilization will fall. Will another human one replace it? I don't know, quite possibly. But it's going to be radically different to this one, for sure.
And will we survive into that next civilization?
Who's we? I mean, what always strikes me about contemporary arguments by liberal progressives is they always talk about we, don't they? We. They're incontinent with the we-ness. And there's a frenzy to it because they're trying, and who are they talking about? They're talking about humanity as a collective phenomenon. I'm with Freud on this. Freud said the commandment to love your neighbor as you love yourself was the cruelest injunction ever made on somebody. It's simply not true. It's a huge, and as events bear out every single day of your lives, you've seen it today. You've walked past a cankerous beggar lying in the gutter on your way here. I know I did, and offered no assistance. We see it played out every day around us. Who are we kidding with our civilizing process? Who are we fooling? We're whistling in the dark.
Thank you.
You can always be guaranteed of a jolly night out. I would say, I mean, I do feel it, and I've been puzzling and talking to my wife here about this today, about, you know, he was pretty unhappy, Sebald, and I can't help but feel it's because he had no resistance. You know, the breadth and the intensity of his vision gave him he couldn't just get in his car and go on holiday to get rid of it, or eat a beef burger in order to get over the problem of the ecological crisis. There was no divertissement for Sebald. There is for me. You'll be glad to know. I'm actually a rather jolly person.
Sebald often begins his stories by saying, after a long period of work, where the process of his walks and his exercising himself through writing becomes his remedy.
Yeah, I think of it often. I mean, I was looking at Rings of Saturn again today, which of course starts with this vision from his hospital bed of this kind of grey window, and thinking of Poe's story, The Man of the Crowd, which begins in a London coffee house with a man who's recovered from an unspecified illness and has the kind of hallucinogenic intensity of gaze that you associate with early convalescence, when it seems as if you've been remade as a person. But and again, the dynamic between the unnamed narrator of the story and the eponymous Man of the Crowd is much like the dynamic you get between, for example, the unnamed narrator of Austerlitz and Austerlitz. So it's the same kind of dynamic. It sets up a kind of monoperspectival narration where you're tied to a particular view in that way. But again, it seems to me that is indicative. The Poe story is about the crushing and emergent anonymity of the civilizations that we now live in. And I think that Sebald uses the device for the same reason, but on arguably a rather grander scale in that one. Yeah. So yeah, that's always there. But also, I think he didn't feel well. I think he suffered genuinely from a sense of malaise. And I suspect that whenever he saw, you know, exhaust fumes blatting out of a car, a vapor trail from an aircraft taking off overhead, or the soot lying on leaves. I mean, after he comes to London, I mean, I remember the London of the 1960s and 70s very vividly. I remember as a child having to feel my way home along the hedges from the tube station in East Finchley to our little semi-detached house because the fog was so thick, and that was a decade after the passing of the Clean Air Act. So and the buildings were black. They were black. And that was the England, of course, that Sebald had arrived in. And I think even that in itself would have been a shock for somebody who'd grown up in village and small town Germany. So, yeah, there you have it. But listen, you know, I want you all to have fun this evening and completely forget about everything I said, which I'm sure you will.
Thank you very much.